Good, thank you. Push the button. And as far as questions, we would like to run this in a fairly interactive way within the limits of our ability to manage it. So please use the chat function to put in any questions or contributions. We're very interested in having a two-way or multiple-way exchange here. So the speakers will be very happy to hear reactions coming through. And to the extent that we can manage the time, we would like to allow some dialogue on the way through. If the time gets too tight, we will definitely have a Q&A session at the end anyway. So I think with that, I think we can start. So the webinar is looking at just transitions, particular reference to the built form and to the construction phases of buildings. We have three really interesting speakers coming from diverse backgrounds, and I think this will be a very rich discussion. Our first speaker is actually an ICLEI person, Sharon, who I'll introduce in a moment. Then we have an elected member, Deputy Lord Mayor Nick Rees from the City of Melbourne. And then we have an academic, Associate Professor Peter Graham from Monash. So we're sort of coming into this theme from three different angles, which I think could be very useful for us. So let's see what comes out of today. First, I'd like to introduce Sharon. Sharon Govinda has very recently joined ICLEI Oceania, but she comes from ICLEI Africa, which of course is a huge and really interesting region to have been working in. And Sharon was working directly with the Global Covenant of Mayors with the 100% renewable energy network, etc. But prior to that, she has a very long history as a planner, an environmental planner in some of the largest councils in South Africa. So we're going to invite Sharon to do a little bit of framing, a little bit of introduction to the concept. And Sharon, over to you. Thank you.
Why, thank you, Steve. So let me start sharing my screen. And good day, good afternoon, everybody. It is a delight to see so many participants today. And if this is an indication of the interest of just transitions in the region, I think we on the right trajectory. Now, just transitions in the net zero built environment will unavoidably impact us socially and economically, and has the potential to be a very polarizing topic. As a matter of fact, even at global conventions, where there have been clarion calls sent for countries to reach net zero by 2050. At the recent COP, as many as 24 countries released a joint statement in opposition to reaching this goal, citing anti-equity and being against climate justice. Of course, what we need to be cognizant of as well is that what social equity in one part of the world could mean something totally else in another part of the world. So there are geographic connotations to social equity that we have to take into consideration. But even within developed countries, we must acknowledge that societies are not homogeneous, all right? And we have to factor this in our just transitions approaches. So here on the screen, we have framed how just transitions can be applied to various contexts within the built environment space. And I've tried to tease out opportunities for intervention. And I've looked at this particularly from a local government lens, okay, which I am sure my fellow panelists will explore in their respective addresses. Under construction, sourcing sustainable and socially responsible material is a key theme. The other is linking disadvantaged groupings with green jobs and upskilling and investment in skills. Under building retrofits, I've enlisted access to funding schemes and equitable or just equitable participation in retrofitting policies as key thematic areas. Now, for new developments, and here I see this as a huge lever for just transitions in the net zero construction space. And we know that state and local governments play a pivotal role in shaping spatial and land use management policies and even building plans approval. So there are huge opportunities here for incentives for just transitions collaborations. Under energy generation, and this is often not looked at in the life cycle approach when we consider just transitions, but the first thing that comes to mind when we talk of equitable transitions, we can think of decentralized community ownership, battery storage, mini grids are some that come to mind, which I'll explore in some of the cases I'm going to cite. Now, as an organization, ICLEI has commissioned guidelines on what socially equitable transitions should actually take the form of, and highlighting specifically the role of local governments. And I think here we can single out access, and this is one way to ensure that vulnerable groups are prioritized for inclusive urban planning. Secondly, involving residents in policy-making processes to ensure nobody's left behind. And thirdly, opportunities for skills development and upskilling, and ensuring fair, equitable, and safe working conditions. I will now briefly go through some of these case studies, which underpin themes of just transition, and I've tried to look at cases from both the developing and the developed north. The first is in South Africa, which actually faces a watershed moment in its low emissions development trajectory, with huge sums of foreign direct investment at this point in time, as much as $8.5 billion US for that matter. But with decarbonization efforts, these are heavily dampened by an impact on the coal mining sector and coal value chains. And whereas there is evidence that skills diversion is possible, the spatial and structural components of coal mining towns would render these spaces obsolete. So in Mpumalanga, which is a massive coal mining belt, there's exciting work coming out of this region, commissioned by ICLEI and supported by agency France Development, to assist local governments repurposing coal mining precincts. And we know that local governments and local municipalities, for that matter, will leverage key roles in this regard. But underpinning South Africa's case is that just transitions has been a very widely consulted, extensive process with strong validation, support, endorsement from agencies like its local government associations. In Kenya, their just transitions efforts come in the form of community-based microgrids, and I mentioned this earlier, massive opportunity here. And these are owned and operated by rural, vulnerable groups. And whereas international donors and agencies have partnered in terms of building or designing and funding the pre-preparatory stages, the project itself has been self-sustained by communities owning responsibility for tariff collection and rendering the initiative self-sustaining. Moving up to the north, in Germany, Stadessen's Green Capital Agency is partnered with research institutions to pair historically deprived communities with more affluent ones through emissions analysis and trading. And through a simple application of an app, carbon footprints are estimated and form the basis of handing out emissions certificates. And the proceeds from the carbon trading is then used for local social and ecological projects. In Sweden, in the city of Stockholm, we've seen participatory approaches where children have informed planning, mobility, active mobility, and transportation within school precincts. So it highlights the opportunities for various sectors of society to be engaged and plan collaboratively for just transitions planning. Now, while climate change is an existential crisis, and we all have to face the consequences in our lifetime, it isn't the only reason for us to transitions to low emissions developments. We've seen just a few examples here of how transformative action can come about to address these climate ambitions, whilst addressing socioeconomic inequality and poverty indicators that have long been pervasive and crippled many economies, developed and developing alike.
Oh.
Thank you, Steve. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sharon. That's a really interesting and comprehensive introduction, and particularly good to see those case studies from 4 different parts of the world. So thank you. I think that frames it very nicely. Just a reminder to everyone, please keep your microphones muted. We had a bit of echo beforehand. And so we're going to go from that quick whip around the globe down, focusing more now on Australia. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Councillor Nicholas Rees. Nick is Deputy Lord Mayor for the City of Melbourne, which actually hosts the ICLEI office here. He has been Deputy Lord Mayor since 2020, and before that was an elected councillor going back to 2016. But Nick is also an executive in the Chancellor at the University of Melbourne, holds an academic position, Principal Fellow, and teaches at the Melbourne School of Government. So quite an interesting spanning from elected member across to academia. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Nick. I think some examples on what City of Melbourne is doing, but also some more general reflections on just transition, sustainable development. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, which for me here on the north bank of the Yarra are the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people, and in their native language, can I say Wominjinka, Marambik Burundap, Wurundjeri Willam U, Liwik U Kulan, Yirimba Bu Yirimboy, which means I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Can I also put on the record the City of Melbourne's appreciation of all the work that ICLEI does, and we see you as an important forum and source of policy advice for us in local government, what we can do to help deliver a just transition. Can I also acknowledge that my councillor colleague, Elizabeth Doige, is on this call today, and I'm hoping we can bring her into the conversation at the conclusion of my remarks, and certainly involve her in the discussion to follow, because Elizabeth, in addition to being a very talented councillor, also has a job as an official with the CFMEU, very large union in Australia, and so she sees firsthand some of the issues that are presented by debates around just transition to zero emissions. So look, in terms of the City of Melbourne, we do really see ourselves as leaders in the transition to net emissions. We declared some 3 or 4 years ago now a climate and biodiversity emergency, and we have put in place targets and policies at the City of Melbourne that are proportionate to the emergency that we have declared. So we're committed to decarbonising the grid by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2040 for the municipality. We're also embedding the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals into the way we plan, report and prioritise investment in the city. It's been a really interesting exercise. So we've taken the UN SDGs and really translated that into the reporting framework for the City of Melbourne. That has a number of positive effects. Firstly, it means that we think quite holistically about what we're doing at the city. It's not just dollars and cents, but covers environmental sustainability, as well as human well-being, health, education, basic human rights. And so it's been a really, really helpful framework for us, and really means that we as an organisation systematically think more deeply and report more meaningfully on what we're doing and the impact that we are having. Today, we're principally talking about the environmental sustainable side of what we are doing and how that interfaces with justice and delivering on a just transition. It reminds me of what a politician said at an international conference some years ago around climate change, when he said, "We all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to do it and then get re-elected." And so that goes to this issue, which continues to plague debate in this area. On the one hand, the science is beyond doubt. As Sharon has said, we face an existential crisis. On the other, some of the costs of transition have been used by politicians to mud the debate, run scare campaigns about the impact of transition on things like household budgets, energy costs, and so on, and win elections. And I say that as somebody who, I had the great honour of serving Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister of Australia, worked in her office as Director of Strategy and Senior Advisor. And we did succeed in introducing a price on carbon in Australia. But we then went on to lose the Prime Ministership, and Labor lost an election. So there's no, I've had a front row seat in the sharp end of the political debate around a just transition. But I'm pleased to say I do think that debate is moving in a positive direction at the moment, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is, I think that there has been a recognition in the community that the impact of climate change is felt disproportionately by vulnerable people. Extreme heat events impact the elderly, children, and those who do not have access to comfortable living environments. When we look at the increased prevalence of extreme weather events and environmental disasters, I'm talking here about multiple catastrophic flood events, multiple catastrophic fires in Australia. They typically affect regional communities and often those who are not in a position to live not on a floodplain or live in a rural area because that's the area that they can afford. And so there's been a recognition that that they're tackling climate change has a strong social justice dimension to it in terms of building social resilience and protecting the most vulnerable in our community. Having said that, that is not the complete picture. And again, I want to make the point that in recent years, we have seen debate about the need for urgent action on climate mugged by politicians who put forward arguments about the cost of transition, the investment that needs to be made, and then how that will flow through to ordinary folks in the form of higher energy bills, higher cost of living, and that has been used to great negative effect, I would say. That is the reality that those on this call need to, we need to be really clear-eyed in facing up to that political challenge around transition. Now, again, I am positive about the trajectory we're on this debate, and I think the election of the Albanese government in Australia was something of a watershed moment in this debate. Albanese was elected on in some ways he reset the debate around climate action because he went to the people and said he was going to lower emissions, he was going to lower energy prices, and he was going to create more jobs. And he was able to credibly make that claim. Now, of course, in this debate, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Probably the major memorable moment in the government's first budget was not the financial measures that were contained in that budget, but a little line in there from the Treasury, which had some estimates about energy prices and the estimate that energy prices were going to go up by 51% in the following year, which then, once the media got onto that, it became the dominant story in the budget. And, within days, the Prime Minister, Treasurer, the Energy Minister was standing up and making commitments about initiatives they're going to take to try and keep a lid on energy prices. Now, again, what was causing energy prices to go up? Well, it was a war in Ukraine, which was a factor. There was a dysfunctional Australian energy market. There was a multitude of factors there. But there were, again, those people, the climate skeptics, the pernicious political types who try and turn this stuff to their advantage, who also made it about decarbonisation of the economy. Again, another reminder to us all of how challenging these debates can be. In terms of a positive experience we're going through in the City of Melbourne at the moment around construction and moving to sustainable settings, we have just released our new Sustainable Building Design Amendment. So that is a major change to the planning scheme in Melbourne, and it does a number of things. The first thing it does is it embeds sustainable building design in our planning code. And actually, before I unpack that, I should just say very quickly that in Melbourne we have a bit of a dirty secret. I've told you how hard we're leaning in on transitioning to net zero. But the truth is we start from a invidious position. The average carbon emissions per person in the municipality of the City of Melbourne is about 31 tonnes per person. Compare that to cities like ours, in the OECD, where it's about 6 tonnes per person. Now, there's two main explanations for that. The first is that something like 80% of, depending on what day or time of the week it is, 80% of Victoria's, actually a bit lower than that now, 70% of Victoria's energy supply comes from brown coal-fired electricity. The second reason for that is that our buildings are nowhere near as efficient as they need to be. So in the City of Melbourne, 66% of our emissions come from our buildings. Compare that to other municipalities around Australia where the average is about 25%. So if we're going to get, Melbourne, Victoria, and ultimately Australia to net zero, two things we've got to do there. First is we've got to get off brown coal. And secondly, we've got to make our buildings way, way more energy efficient and far more sustainable in their building and design. So tackling building, we're putting new sustainable building design standards into our planning code. We're also just lifting standards across the board in terms of energy efficiency, water efficiency, requirement for a renewable energy source, making buildings electric vehicle ready, and so on and so on and so on. We've also introduced a thing called the Green Fact tool to require new buildings to have a certain amount of green infrastructure on them. Green walls, green foyers, green roofs, and I'm delighted to say people absolutely love it because they love buildings that have that shrubbery and greenery built into the building. Finally, we're also, as part of these amendments, encouraging. I use the word encouraging quite specifically, but not mandating as yet adaptive reuse of buildings. So, if you're going to build a new tower in Melbourne, don't just drop the tower that's there. Think about how you can use the existing building to create something new out of. And then finally, we're also pushing for new signage on new developments so that when the big yellow signs go up the front telling the world what's coming on this site, we will also include the embodied carbon of the new development. So we start building public awareness of the fact that, yes, there's a lot of carbon in buildings, and buildings are a huge source of emissions in our community. And I think that's going to be a hugely important thing as well. Now, Steve, I am conscious I've been talking for quite a while, and you did mention in my other job that I am indeed a lecturer at the University of Melbourne. So I'm conscious of a talking head on a screen can be quite boring. So I might pause at that point and invite conversation and discussion. But perhaps before we do that, if the technical maestros on this call could maybe offer my councillor colleague, Elizabeth Doidge, the opportunity to reflect on our agenda at the City of Melbourne as well.
Thanks, Nick. I can assure you we're not bored. It's been a fascinating journey. Elizabeth, isn't it? Would you like to come on? Just put on your camera and your microphone and go for it.
For sure. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. My name's Elizabeth Doidge. I am a councillor with the City of Melbourne, where I am lucky enough to chair the Sustainable Building Portfolio. And I also am the Deputy Chair on our Environment Portfolio. And as our wonderful Deputy Lord Mayor also mentioned, I also work for the CFMEU, which for those who are not familiar, it is a construction union, specifically a union that represents workers in large-scale commercial major transport infrastructure projects. So areas where a just transition is not only important, but there's a huge amount of opportunity there. So I want to thank Sharon for your introductory speech before, and I want to thank the DLM for all the points you touched on. I won't carry on too much about it, but I do want to point out, before I get to some of the things we're doing at City of Melbourne, I want to point out that I'm really impressed by how much I want to say the market is leading in this space. in some ways it's a little disappointing to see market leading before government. And I'm not just, I'm not being critical of my own local government, the City of Melbourne, but all levels of government in Australia. I mean, I think, the DLM kind of alluded to this before. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of, we know we want to do these things. And, there's organisations all across the sector are setting emissions reductions targets. But that big question of how do we actually do this, I don't see as being answered as well as it could be. And that's not to say there isn't fantastic work being done. But when I've been digging a little bit, I found that, there's some major construction companies and some big builders that are really doing fantastic work and incentivising and looking at new technologies and exploring what we can be doing. And, the DLM spoke about this fantastic planning scheme amendment to uplift the environmental performance and standards of a lot of new buildings in the City of Melbourne. Well, there's a lot of buildings out there and a lot of developers and companies already doing this, which is great. My question are, why aren't other levels of government doing this? And then the other question is, well, what about all the existing buildings that have already been constructed that are out of date, that need these major environmental upgrades? If at anything we want to meet our emissions reductions targets, that's one of my little pet projects. It's more than a project. It's an important policy initiative that City of Melbourne is driving. Is looking for ways that we can target those really poor performing buildings across our city, many of whom are the major contributors to our emissions within the city. And it's an interesting question to tackle, because you can look at it from a purely environmental perspective and say, yes, there are amazing opportunities and, there's work that has to be done here. You can look at it from a technological and research and development side of things, like, yep, this is great. We can contribute to the conversation around sustainability. I find myself leaning further towards, in many cases, having the conversation around, hey, there are commercial benefits. Again, as has already been touched on today, that, you can lower your energy bills significantly. You can improve your indoor thermal comfort. Looking at environmental performance in the context of, again, office spaces, there's some fantastic work that City of Melbourne did called Breath Project, where we looked at improving indoor air quality at the same time as lowering emissions and lowering energy bills. So there are massive health benefits to a lot of the work in a just transition as well. And I also love looking at indoor air quality, because fewer people getting sick, again, has commercial benefit. That means in an office space, you have fewer people calling in sick to work. You have better productivity. It's just better for everybody. But how do we actually really, really drive these initiatives? So this is a lot of what we're doing at City of Melbourne. We've kind of on our, let's call it our retrofitting adventure. We're looking at how we retrofit these mid-tier buildings, and we're at the stage of stakeholder consultation. We've put 7 different initiatives. I won't go into the details of that now, because we've got lots to talk about, but 7 different proposed initiatives on ways we can target those mid-tier buildings and assist the community to improve the environmental performance of those buildings. And what's something that's fantastic about doing this at the local government level is you have much greater access to the community, and the community also has much greater access to us to provide us with that feedback as well. So I'm really enjoying having those conversations and listening to the ideas, and I've got to say, listening to the ambition from a lot of building owners who want to be a part of this and want to tackle climate change, want to play their part, but also see, again, that there's potentially a commercial benefit to it. And I mean, I must say, upfront capital costs to upgrade a building can be very, very expensive, can be very, very difficult to get your head around, especially if perhaps you and your family bought that 5-story office building 30 years ago. It might have a 2-star neighbours rating. How on earth do you upgrade that building? Do you bring in a plumber and an electrician and this and that and coordinate those services yourself? That's a huge amount of work. But it's an opportunity for the City of Melbourne to play a leading role in that. And that's what we're doing. And it's a fantastic project to be a part of. And I'm really excited that we're actually going to be able to drive some change through this. So sorry to bang on a little bit there. That's just a quick contribution I was hoping to make.
We're always happy to accommodate banging on, don't worry. Thanks.
I do it well. Cheers,
Thanks,
everyone.
Elizabeth. Look, just before we leave the City of Melbourne, I just wanted to insert a bit of information. Melbourne City and Melbourne University are just about to embark on a Building for Today and the Future research project, and it's actually funded by the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is really interesting. And the one sentence description is, the project will develop and advance a collaborative agenda for inclusive climate action in the built environment, grounded in international human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. So terrific initiative, just kicking off. ICLEI has a very, very tiny role in all of that, which we're very proud of. So thank you very much to both of our City of Melbourne speakers. Terrific context. We are right on times and there's no particular chat questions, so we'll progress to our third and final speaker. So over to Peter Graham, Associate Professor. Peter's the stream lead in architectural performance in the Department of Architecture at Monash University. He's Executive Director of the Global Buildings Performance Network, which is an international network of experts dedicated to achieving the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector. Now, Peter's also Chief Investigator for the Buildings Living Laboratory in the ARC linkage project at Monash, the Net Zero Precincts project. And again, ICLEI is a very proud partner to that project. And the Net Zero Precincts project is actually focusing largely on how to manage the transition. So again, it's a very transition-focused sort of approach. So Peter, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and I would like to see if that's working, first of all. Can you see the big screen or not?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Let me just put the slide deck up then. All right, can you see the full slides or the speaker's notes? I'm always just
if you put the cursor over the first slide, I think it'll work.
All right. How's that?
No, we're still seeing all your notes and so on.
Okay, sorry
It's
for
not
this.
the presentation view.
No, I'll just change the view. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. As the last speaker, I suppose I'm privileged to have heard all of the inputs so far, and I can respond a little bit. But what I'd like to talk about in this context is how we turn commitments for zero emissions precincts and just transitions into action, or sort of into reforms. And our research at Monash is dealing with a range of the issues that have been discussed already today. So the first thing I'll put, and I added the quote, Nick. I think it's a very apt challenge for us to face. Is we know how to make we know what to do in terms of making transitions to zero emissions. There's formulas for achieving that in the building sector, both from a technical point of view, at a systems level through energy efficiency, switching to electrification, decentralized renewable energy, grid interconnectivity, and so on. And there's also many insights we've gained into policies that work across the building life cycle as well. A lot of that coming from research that we're leading at Monash and also through the GBPN. But as you pointed out, that's really not the issue anymore. The issue is how to do it. And there are a range of pressures which have been raised both by Nick and Elizabeth around what people's reactions are, either in terms of getting elected or the business case and all these sorts of things. So these are the real issues that we're trying to deal with in using engaged research to drive reforms. So the way we are looking at supporting all of these initiatives with research is through helping decision makers understand the context and the shift in the argument really and the data from what we used to talk about are where are the tons of emission abatement potential and what are the technical opportunities. Now we're really interested in who are the beneficiaries. So it's not so much saying, how do you get net zero buildings or net zero precincts? It's what can net zero precincts or net zero buildings do for your public policy priorities in terms of economic development, achieving sustainable development goals, providing health benefits, and so on. So there's a shift in our scope, I guess, in our focus. There's a lot of commitments being made, both in the private sector and also in the public sector. And this is a really important element for engaged research. So rather than having research which is generating evidence about why we should act, the research is focusing now more on how do we help those organisations that have made commitments to win, to achieve their goals. And we're doing that by looking at a range of methods, and I'll go through a couple of those now, which are about pathways and implementation. But the most important thing really is about reforms, and this gets to the point of how to get re-elected. We are doing a range of research projects around the world where we are taking a real people-centered approach involving the beneficiaries, and we call it bottom-up transformation, particularly for the building sector. That's really where it's at, because there's just so much variety in building markets from city to city, and even from parts of cities. We really need to understand and build strong local coalitions to drive sustained reforms. So that's the overview. I wanted to tell a couple of stories from the outcomes of some of our research to date. So one of the projects we're working on is in India on the affordable housing program, the National Affordable Housing Program in India, which has been set up to address housing for all. And it's an important aspect of their sustainable development. But the projects are not being designed with people's comfort in mind. And we've been looking at the health implications of living in apartments which regularly get up to over 34 degrees Celsius in summer. And this has a knock-on effect, not just in terms of individual health, but also domestic violence rates go up. And vulnerable communities are the ones who are really at the pointy end. So solving one sustainability problem is creating and locking in a whole range of other ones. So that's an issue. In the city of Samarinda, we're working in Indonesia and in a number of places to support policy reforms that are leading to decarbonisation of buildings. And I'll show you some data in a second about this project. But here again, the governments aren't regulating energy efficiency in the housing sector because they feel it's too hard to regulate. So we've been focusing on appliance standards, and that's a way of reducing cooling energy demand. But our research has shown the governments that the buildings are very poorly designed. So all of that cool air is leaking out, and the internal temperatures are about the same as the external temperatures most of the year round. So it's better from an economic point of view to focus on building regulations rather, or in addition to appliance standards. And of course, this is an issue which Australia is facing as well, that buildings which are not fit for the climate emergency, for a start, retrofitting was mentioned as well. There's a really urgent issues because there's such a huge economic and health burden, not to mention the environmental burden. So there's that. We're doing quite a lot of work to provide an evidence base for co-benefits of transitions to zero emissions with Monash Sustainable Development Institute and Behaviour Works, and trying to build up that evidence base for policymakers, and not just from the point of view of science, but also from the lived experience of people who have moved from, say, from poor housing to better housing. And one of the interesting aspects around this is also just changing the narrative and understanding just how gendered the language is around benefits of sustainability, and hearing from, families, particularly women and children who are mostly affected by the way buildings operate. So that builds up a really strong evidence base for public policy and involves communities in the research. That helps us deal with commitments. We've got so many commitments, but we haven't got a lot of time to actually achieve them. So there's an urgency to the way we need to engage with research and act. So we talk about action research a lot. And this framework on the screen here is a framework for bottom-up stakeholder-led policy reform that's come from a series of action research projects we've been doing, mainly in Indonesia. But it puts people first. It's about understanding the sort of social dynamics of an area and of a market, and finding those people who can form a strong coalition for change, and then empowering them mainly with data about how the built environment's operating across a range of metrics, including health, jobs, energy, emissions, and so on, and then building plans for change with them that they can sustain. So it's about sustained just transitions. We've used this to develop a range of new policies in Indonesia over the last couple of years, which has been interesting, and it'd be good to be able to do that more in Australia. So to finish off, just a walk through some of the methods that we're using and some opportunities for interaction with these sorts of research programs. So Steve mentioned Living Labs in the RSE Net Zero Precinct Living Lab. So that's one important method that is, it looks like it's a good model for achieving reforms and sustaining reforms over time. And so I'll just give you a quick view of this one. So this ARC linkage project is a 4-year project with partners from the private sector, municipal governments such as Monash, ICLEI, of course, GBPN, and ENGIE and CSIRO. And basically the idea is for us to understand, using design ethnography, design anthropology, what are the lived experiences of people in these precincts? What are their priorities? And how does that marry up with what are the technical opportunities and needs to transition that precinct to net zero? And then building an ecosystem of actions that can lead to achieving that goal. And as Steve said, I'm developing a living lab for the buildings or the built environment component of that precinct, but there's also the whole issue of the energy supply and mobility around that precinct as well. So this is these living labs are really a good way to sustain a kind of a learning and a continual improvement process, I suppose, where you are anchoring the process of reform with key institutions and building that local coalition. You're providing a framing which is around what are the targets, what are the goals, and understanding that even if you're thinking about net zero, different stakeholders have got different goals that all contribute to the same outcome. So being able to map those is really important. Developing collaborative governance for these communities to work together in a transparent way, achieve the goals that they have for their own stakeholder group, but feel like they're participating in the operation of the overall program. And then, of course, being able to share the results openly and iteratively, so that, I mean, let's face it, as we have gone through all these different experiments in net zero, we're always learning something new. Every building is unique, so we're always learning, and we need to be able to share that. So that's the basic model, and that's working. That Living Lab program is in Clayton. I think Melbourne Uni's probably got a number of initiatives like this as well. And then the last one is about how that translates in a community setting. So this one was in East Kalimantan in Samarinda. And here again, using the same model, building a local coalition of decision makers and industry stakeholders to develop their own plan for change, and then providing an opportunity for understanding where they could make the biggest change, in this case to energy savings in homes which weren't regulated, working out which sorts of policy actions would make the biggest difference, and this one addressing cooling, but understanding that most of the cooling opportunities were in better buildings rather than just efficient appliances. And that led to options that we could quantify the benefits for the community. So in this case, savings in terms of emissions and also energy cost savings as well. So communicating the economic benefits as well as the climate benefits. And that led to the first green building regulation outside of Java being adopted in 2021. So you can make real change. And just to finish off, there's a lot of opportunities beyond the ones that I've just outlined that we're working on in the faculty that I'm in, that deal with a range of just transition issues, including how to involve vulnerable communities in designing solutions in the built environment, the building sector, sort of innovation pathways through the Future Buildings Initiative, the whole range of things going on slums and informal settlements, GBPN, of course, dealing with policy, and then the Buildings 4.0 CRC, which a number of universities are involved in now, which is engaging strongly with the private sector in how to make these transitions just and effective. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Peter. That really rounded things off very well, I think. Yeah, I have been a little bit involved in the ARC project in Monash, and I suppose I went in fairly naively thinking net zero precinct technical solutions, and it was made very clear to me very early it's a total people-centered approach. All the people, there was a lot of research done in year one of students, the many small businesses that support a campus, obviously the staff surrounding residences, surrounding industries, etc. So a very interesting model. And as someone who's lived on, I think it was the 25th floor of a high-rise apartment building in Jakarta for quite a few years, I can certainly attest to the energy efficiency and cooling being one of the highest priorities. Yeah. So look, we finished our whip around, and it's interesting. We started international, came to Melbourne, Australia, and then finished off again international. We've got a few minutes, and we can go over time. That's not a problem if people would like to join in. Just keeping an eye on the chat and also on the participants list. So Sam Shaw, will we be able to share the presentations? Sharon, I would say yes, and Peter, I would say yes. Okay, certainly do that. And we'll have the recording available. I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit here, and I might be wrong, but I've been really pleased to see Jill Whittaker has joined us. And if it's the Jill Whittaker I know, I think she's the Mayor of Campbelltown in Adelaide.
That's correct.
Oh, great. I got you. Okay. Jill,
Yeah.
would you like to offer a little bit of your impressions of today or what's happening in Campbelltown?
Oh, very happy to do that. I suppose the thing that I'm very impressed by is the proposal that we do more retrofitting. Campbelltown has been a city where we have had enormous numbers of our buildings, about 60, 70 years old, knocked over. We have been prevented by planning rules from actually readapting them for multiple people, so that we have many, many people who are in big houses that they no longer really want to maintain. So those people sell up, the house is knocked down and replaced with usually not terribly energy efficient buildings. So I was really interested to hear about the ARC and the way that it could be a model for a city such as ours, where we have got lots of need for new housing, but we don't have the land. And so the land is being reutilised in a way that is probably pretty inefficient, because the new buildings that are being put up are not addressing the climate solutions. We're having housing that's going up that is not energy efficient. So energy efficiency is not one of the criteria for the planning system. So we have developers coming in. We've got cheaper houses. People are getting housing, so that's good. But we aren't really addressing the sorts of heating and cooling and energy usage situation that we need to. So it's been very useful to be hearing about those sorts of things that are happening elsewhere.
Great. Thanks, Jill, and all the best for Campbelltown. We've certainly done quite a lot of work with some of the Adelaide inner suburban councils. And yeah, one of the big concerns is the lack of green canopy and green space with all of the infill development. So that's the other side of the same coin, I guess. Looking at the chats, I noticed we've got someone from City of Melbourne, Jack, I think, who came in, Jack Blackwell, yes, with some of the background information to the planning scheme amendments. Jack, I'm assuming you're a planner.
I'm Zero Carbon Buildings Officer here at the City of Melbourne, so I'm
Oh,
I'm
good
helping
on
with the I suppose developing the policy for retrofits, and I had a little bit of background on C376 planning amendment as well, so helping develop that policy.
Thanks for your contribution. Anything you'd like to add?
I mean, the other thing that I might point out towards that's not necessarily in my wheelhouse is the Make Room and Homes Melbourne initiatives that we've got as well within the City of Melbourne, which is all about when we're talking about just transitions, that's about making sure that those who are, the least fortunate within the city have, safe housing, reducing homelessness, and that all gets lumped together in terms of thinking about what we need to do with the existing building stock as well. So there's, I'll send a couple of links before we finish up here in the chat, but
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
worth everyone looking at that as well.
Terrific. Thanks, Jack. And one other very interesting person is Josh Briggs. Josh looks like you're an elected member at Hutt City Council in New Zealand. Have we got Josh still there? Not necessarily. Okay, looks like we've lost him.
No,
Good to
he's
hear.
there. He was just swinging his camera on.
Kia ora, everybody.
g'day. G'day.
I'm Kia ora from New Zealand.
Yeah.
Fantastic session today. Really appreciated all of the insights and learnings. It's a lot for our city, who's growing really quickly at the moment, to take on board. So really appreciate all of your sharing today.
Terrific. And Josh, can I introduce you to Sharon, our first speaker, because she is going to be doing some direct work with cities in New Zealand as part of her role. So
Wonderful. Look forward to meeting and connecting with you after today's session, Sharon. Thank you.
fantastic. So that probably just about brings us to the end, unless there's anyone else would like to make a contribution. You're always welcome. Okay. Well, look, we had 3 prepared speakers and about another 3 or 4 terrific impromptu speakers. So that's great. Really nice to hear from you all. And I hope the session today was very productive. One thing we do offer at ICLEI is if there is any interest in particular parts of today's webinar that you'd like to follow up, there's nothing to stop us from offering follow-up webinars. So please just shoot a note through to myself or Sharon, and we'll talk to you about that. Okay. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.